This is how the triumph of democracy must look. Everybody is well-fed, happy, elegantly dressed, well-mannered, considerate, and respectful of the other's opinion, whatever it may be. Where else ought one look for the triumph of democracy but in good old Europe? Democracy, though, has a remarkable feature. It only works if available to one and all. If rights are guaranteed to some people only, the whole society is deprived. This is why the Europeans, just as consistent idealists would do, are fighting so fiercely for the victory of democratic values for all people worldwide. They demand that these values be granted to every mother's son, even to the IRA and the Red Brigades, and Sheikh Yassin, and Abu Hamza, and lots of other theorists and experts of terror. Europe has always been predominantly left-wing liberal. The left sector of the European political spectrum embraces the usually rebellious youth and university professors with their Olympian calm, as well as human rights watchers and presidents. They are all very nice and good-hearted people, but nice and educated as they are, there are some things they hate deeply. Racism, colonialism, imperialism, capitalism in the wider sense, and of course, war. Europe is firm in demanding from the whole world that there be no war, and thus you must fall all over yourself to find a peaceful dialogue with Saddam Hussein or with Palestinian terrorists. This becomes some sort of a polite demand. Die if you must, but everything must stay quiet and peaceful. When others are betrayed, it's neither shocking nor news for people living in the 21st century. It is much more difficult to explain why the Europeans are not willing to see the threat for themselves. The original population of Europe is drastically diminishing, while the number of Muslims is on the rise. According to a relatively optimistic UN forecast, by the year 2300, Europeans will account for less than 6% of the world's population. There will be half as many Italians and Bulgarians as there are now. Yasser Arafat once threatened Israel in a most extravagant way. "We shall overwhelm you with the Palestinian womb," he said. The words, in all their naturalistic absurdity, are true, yet much more relevant to the European nations. Will the Europeans manage to survive ethnically? What can Europe, with its homosexuality, euthanasia, and other benefits of civilization, set against the Islamic culture? The Muslims equate abortion with murder and consider childbearing an indisputable merit. Being acutely aware of the threat, the Europeans are good at displacing it, as psychoanalysts would put it. The Psychological Dictionary says, "The pathological anxiety makes a person seek for a sense of safety that can be compared to the safety of prison. This safety is elusive and is guaranteed by self-imposed limitations. The person is afraid of things that he should not be afraid of and feels safe where there is no safety." The European ideology has given much to the world. It has overcome poverty, lawlessness, and racism, and justly deserves our deep respect for that. But is it up to the current challenges? From the European vantage point, the rich are always at fault with the poor, the strong with the weak, the civilized with the savage. The concept was born in the Age of Enlightenment. The world has changed since then, but the Europeans stick stubbornly to the old dogmas. Paradox or some odd logic it may be, but adherence to the liberal values has invariably led Europe to support pure evil. It sided with Mao Zedong and Saddam Hussein, held in reverence the Stalinist USSR, praised Fidel Castro, and even supported hardened criminals. When did the human rights watchers join hands with those who twist and manipulate the law? The Reportedly, John Lennon, when asked in the 60s to write an anti-war song, said, "I won't do it if you're going to sing it carrying Mao's portraits." And it makes no difference whether the affection for Mao has been replaced with that for Yasser Arafat and Che Guevara. The latter would pull the trigger at the slightest provocation, dreamt of a world of carnage, and stuck to the concept one, two, many Vietnams. Teenage fashion nowadays is unthinkable without Che t-shirts and the so-called Arafat plates. But there have always been, and there will be other youth idols. What matters is that there hasn't been a single red dictator in the newest history that the left liberal community hasn't worshipped. You keep on saying Mao, Mao. What do you mean by this word Mao? What, as a matter of fact, do you want from Mao? Not only from Mao, but from communism. I think that the best and most proper communism is in China. The evolution of the left's passions has enigmas of its own. The first oddity is the European intellectual's cult of Mao, with his Cultural Revolution and killings of intellectuals. Two things stood in the way of the Cultural Revolution, and these are education and intellectuals. Thus, an end was put to education. In September 1966, in Beijing alone, the Red Guards murdered 1,750 people, writers, professors, and artists. Equally sad and obscure is the story of how European and American progressives served the Soviet totalitarianism in the 30s to the 50s. Hence the second mystery. Why didn't even open trials of the public enemies ever make know-it-alls like Kim Philby see the true nature of the Soviet Union? Of course, we can put it all down to the ignorance of real life in the USSR, and the Communist Party was disguised abroad as an advocate of liberal values. The Soviets were good at keeping their secrets, the greatest of which was the low efficiency and the tyranny of the Soviet system. The left adored Joseph Stalin and the Soviet country. All the people, from the youngest to the oldest, demand that the traitors and spies who have sold our motherland out to the enemy be gunned down like vicious dogs and look forward to their death. In 1939, 300 leading American intellectuals signed a statement condemning the fantastic lie that the Soviet Union is in any way akin to totalitarian states. Neither the Stalin-Hitler Pact, nor the aggression against Finland, nor the annexation of the Baltic states and part of Poland, nor the information on millions of victims of the USSR shook the great and bright feeling. I take it, comrades, that I will express the opinion of all those present and of the whole proletariat if I say that those bastards must be shot. The backbone of the Communist Party was made up with Soviet intelligence officers, and most of the leftists were unaware of the fact. Some of them, though, contacted Soviet spies stationed abroad, especially when the U.S. started work on the nuclear bomb. American radio engineer Julius Rosenberg was nicknamed Antenna and later Liberal by Soviet intelligence. Englishman Klaus Fuchs collaborated with the Russians in 1941. They passed calculations on atomic fission over to Moscow. Klaus Fuchs was arrested in England in 1950, pleaded guilty, and was sent to prison for 14 years. He served 9 of them, went to the German Democratic Republic to confess to the Russians he had come under the spell of the bourgeois propaganda. Fuchs died in 1988. The man who had for 3 times changed his camp was posthumously awarded the Order of the People's Friendship in the USSR. The execution of Rosenberg and his wife in 1953 provoked worldwide protests and made the Rosenberg spies the main characters of the left epos. Joseph Brodsky wrote an essay called Cambridge Education, in which he blamed the Cambridge system for having educated 3 of the 4 most famous Soviet spies in Europe. It is true that the leading intellectuals, Cambridge's best graduates, spied for the USSR. The well-trodden path of the bourgeois elite was guaranteed for them, but their state appeared to them as a totalitarian empire, so they chose to embrace the opposite one, much more dreadful. Kim Philby was one of the most famous Cambridge-educated spies. Anthony Blunt, a major English art critic, was also denounced at the end of his life as a long-serving Soviet spy. Those who were not in the intelligence service sided with the USSR too. Among them were philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, art director Jean-Luc Godard, and physicist Frédéric Joliot-Curie. Could they have all been blind? Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev had the gift of creative phrasing. Nuclear bombs, as he put it, were baked in the USSR like hot dogs, but it is the United States alone that the left in Europe were angered by. Those in the Kremlin in command of the bombs and missiles were hardly predictable, hardly sympathetic, and took no care of human rights. But still they were in good standing with the European left. In 1983, the military confrontation in Western Europe, as well as the anti-war movement, reached its climax. The Soviet SS-18 and SS-20 missiles deployed in Europe gave the USSR a military superiority. The West decided to station U.S. Pershing II missiles in Europe too. The USSR immediately sent 12.5 nuclear submarines to the U.S. coasts, and then the progressive public came forward. Picketers encircled all the military bases, but it was not the missiles aimed at the Europeans that stirred them up. They were all against the missiles that were there to defend them. The Kremlin condescendingly grinned at the English women as they picketed Greenham Common Air Base, and the hippies spitting on GIs and shouting murderers of children. Marchers exercised their wits. A huge dummy McRonald burger stuffed with warheads is one of the many examples. Every time the U.S. launchers were on the move to escape the Russian sights, activists with posters, pickets, and journalists would immediately show up. They would flock around the military and block their movement. Any concealment was out of the question. As Newsweek pointed out, Reagan's military success will cost dearly. The U.S. has become a target of the Europeans' anger. Pro-Arab feelings in Europe and hostility towards Israel have a long history. Europe used them, among other things, to dissociate itself from the United States. These other things are highly irrational. The belief that the Americans and the Israelis strive for world domination can neither be explained nor refuted. It is not the real Israel and the U.S. with whom the Europeans are still fighting, but their images that can be hated so comfortably. America, intoxicated with money and military power and willing to impose its order worldwide. Israel, an aggressor, crushing its defenseless neighbors, and nobody bothers to substantiate the point. That is a fact by itself. In 2001, French representative to the European Parliament, Jean-Marie Couteau, made a statement that was not at all usual. The Frenchman suggested that Europe provide the Arabs with nuclear weapons to fight Israel. That was the policy of my country in the 70s when we helped Iraq go nuclear, he proudly said. There really was such a page in French history. In 1981, French engineers built an atomic reactor for Iraq. Since Saddam Hussein had already threatened neighboring Israel with bomb attacks, now Israel took the threat quite seriously. So seriously that military aircraft were sent to bomb their reactor. The progressive public was unanimous and decisive in shaming Israel. But in the 90s, it was agreed that the bombing had been beneficial. The nightmare of Saddam with a nuclear bomb never became a reality. Never before has the concept of human rights been so despised as it is now. This is the opinion expressed in an annual report of Amnesty International. The list of offenders is strikingly biased. The United States is blamed for the most outrageous human rights violation in the last 50 years. In the final analysis, Pol Pot, who wiped out a third of his country's population, was a lesser violator of human rights than the United States. Human rights activists claim that the U.S. and the European nations have abused the aftermath of the September 11th events to amend their legislation in a way that allows them to deal with dissenters. Israel is, of course, blamed for the killings of Palestinians and destruction of their homes. The report ignores the statistically confirmed fact that Israeli operations target terrorists, while Palestinian terror is aimed at the Israelis at large. In its report, Amnesty International reflects the opinion of all European human rights organizations and puts forth another enigma of the mysterious European soul. Why does human rights protection